I'm pleased to introduce Memories of Port Sydney, a slideshow prepared by Bill Clark Sr. Bill was born in Port Sydney in 1918. He served for 23 years as an elected councillor of our village. He and his wife Lilla owned the Pine Lodge and the Village Inn, and were active in all aspects of tourism. Bill worked to involve the village in the Cavalcade of Colour, sports car racing on Mary Lake, building a ski hill beside the community centre, and founding the original Recreation Committee. Bill led the move to establish the Port Sydney Volunteer Fire Department. He also served as chair of the Land Severance Committee. Bill is very interested in history. He has made a fascinating slide collection from old photographs. Ryan Kidd has organized these photos thematically. Bill has once again served his community by working to preserve our history before it is lost. Join Bill now on a fascinating tour of Port Sydney past.
This is a sketch of the Sydney Smith Mills and Lumbering in Port Sydney. This is taken out of the 1879 Parry Sound Muskoka Atlas. It shows the faucet store, the butcher store, the bridge, the first bridge across above the rapids in Port Sydney. Also shows the mill in the distant. This is a picture of Sidney Smith. He's the man with the beard lying down, and some of his friends. One of his cousins is Mr. Grafton from Stratford, Ontario. This is a picture of the first dam that was put across the Muskoka River about 1872. This is a picture of the way the mill was bought from Mr. McAlpine, who started to establish it in 1868. But he ran out of funds and he had to give it up. And Sidney Smith came along with some money in his jeans and bought it in 1871. And from there, it just bloomed into quite an establishment in the village of Port Sydney. This is a picture of Sidney Smith's house, which was adjacent to the mill. The building to the left was we always called Sidney Smith's barn. This is an early picture of the mill, which has been expanded on with a grist mill to the right and also a kill, the building off to the left of the main building. And Sidney Smith's house is over across the water, and his barn is off to the left. And you can see behind where all the trees have been pretty well devastated off the hill. Another picture of the mill from a different angle, showing the steamer not the Ramona, but the Northern, that was built in 1876 and started to sail in 1877 from Port Sydney up to Hoodstown at a daily run of 56 miles. This is a picture of some of the early loggers that brought the logs to the mill for Sidney Smith to cut up into lumber. This is a picture of coming out of the bush. You can see the size of the logs. Looks like the logs of one tree there with the big one on the top and just the horses pulling it on the sleigh. This is a picture of some of the early pioneer life in Port Sydney. This is cutting of the cordwood pulled by one oxen. This is a picture of the logs that were piled up along what we call the mill pond. This is just adjacent to Sidney Smith's house, and they were piled there till the spring breakup when they were taken down and run through the mill. This is another picture of a little later on, about 1890. The logs were coming down from Brunel Township. They used to pile them over on what we call Sandy Beach and waited for the breakup. Most of the logs in this area were taken down the river to Bracebridge and to Gravenhurst to the mills in that area. This is another picture of the logs. There was quite a few acres. You can see the number of men that would be involved up in the township Brunel to achieve this pile of logs. This is a picture of one of the early dams that was built in 1914. You can see the logs were going through the sluiceway. They have all the stop logs out, so this is the spring of the year, and you can see where they piled the stop logs were at the upstream of the dam, so that the other side was used for walking, and this is where they've walked there for 100 and some years. This is a picture taken from what we call Sidney Smith's Hill. Shows on the right a boom of logs waiting to be brought down to the mill. In the distance is the cheese factory, Christ Church, built in 1873. The cheese factory was established by Sidney Smith and a group of farmers around the lake. His steamer Jem used to go around the lake and pick up the milk and bring it to the cheese factory, and they made an average of 300 pounds of cheese a day. So it looks like Port Sidney was living on cheese. This is a picture of the rapids. You can see some of the logs that were piled up on the rapids. The drivers would have to go out there with their cant hooks and try and loosen the logs up to get them on their way down to Bracebridge. This is a picture of just south of the mill pond. Before, the logs used to get stuck in the rapids, so the lumbermen built a small dam just downriver from the rapids to raise the water enough that there was enough room for the logs to flow over the rapids and down through the sluiceway on their way down to Bracebridge. This is another picture of the same dam from a different angle. Many years later, it looks like at this point it's not being used. This picture of the first wooden bridge over the, not the first wooden bridge, but it was the second wooden bridge that was over the river. This was built about 1885. You can see the tall trees off to the left. This is another picture of the mill. You can see the sawdust runway that came up, and they used to dump the sawdust right in the river, which wasn't a good practice, of course. This is another picture of the mill with the lumber piled up alongside the runway. They had a runway that came out from the mill and right along by the mill pond, and also down Ontario Street. This is a picture of some of the men that worked in the mill, and the jack ladder is on the right where the logs were taken up the jack ladder up to the saw level, and then they were brought down and out this other door at the left and out on the tramway out to be piled up to be dried. There's another picture of the same mill showing the mill pond and a little barge that was used there for maintenance. And this is a picture of the shingle mill that was built in front of Mary Lake Inn, or in front of Quigley's at the time. It was owned by the Utterson Lumber Company, and they made shingles. This is a picture of an old log cabin that also shows the roofing that was maintained at that time out of cedar, hollow cedar logs that were piled. Gives you an idea of how the pioneers coped with lack of shingles that they had at the time. This is a layout of one of the first plans of Port Sidney that Sidney Smith put in 1874. He owned the land right from South Mary Lake Road up to what we always used to call the Utterson Road on both sides of the Muskoka River. And he divided into 66-foot lots. He gave a lot for the church. He gave a lot for the picnic grounds. He also gave a lot to the Knox United Church. And also a lot for the music hall, which was up on top of what we used to call Town Hall Hill. This is a picture of the Alf Kay establishment down the river from Port Sidney, about 3 miles. The Kays were one of the early pioneer families that came over from Britain and established themselves, and they were quite a well-known pioneer family. This is the first building that they lived in, but at this point here it's being used as a sheep shed by the look of it. This is an early picture of Port Sidney. On the left is the Hug-a-Bone store. Mr. Hug-a-Bone had a owned the property on lots 25 and lots 24 in the 7th concession, and he was the first one in Port Sydney to build a store. He was also the first reeve of Stevenston Township. The building to the right of that is my great-grandfather's establishment. They built that in 1874, and he opened a store there as well. This is a picture of the Bellevue Hotel, built by Arthur Clark, my uncle, in 1906. He established this and ran it for about 15 years. The ship down in the front is the Ramona that came down from Huntsville. This is another picture of the Bellevue in the far in the background. It was a 3-story building and held about 50 to 60 guests. This is a picture of the lakefront looking north. The first building in the center is the house that I live in at the present time. It was built by the Alexander family about 1908. And it also shows the Bellevue Hotel in the background behind that. This is one of the earliest cottages that were built in Port Sydney about 1910. This was built by my grandfather and my uncle Arthur. This is a picture of the Liddell store that was established in 1874 in Port Sydney and ran till 1905 under the Liddell name, and then it changed to Matthew McClure, then on a series of other owners. This is a picture of the Liddell establishment showing the swampy area in front, which was full of lily pads. This is where the present parking lot is next to the wharf in Port Sydney. This is an early picture of the roads in Port Sydney, taken about 1890. And this is one of the early establishments built by the McGinnis family. It is now the Bodil restaurant. This is a picture of the cheese factory that I stated further before. It was right on the Muskoka River. There was a dock adjacent to this, which we called the cheese dock. This is where the gem came in with the milk, and was taken up to the cheese factory and into vats. And after the cheese was made, the whey was taken across the river by a pipeline to a pig pen that was on the other side. So they not only made cheese, but they raised pigs as well with the leftover whey. This is an early picture of Port Sydney taken in 1928 by one of the first planes that came in from the Canadian government. You can see how bare the land was. Every tree was cut down that could be made into lumber. But now it's much more beautiful, and the trees are growing up, and it's really a different place. This taken in 1928 as well. It shows the bridge at the end of what we call Brunel Road. That was the cement bridge made in 1926, and it shows the three. Well, there was 3 different routes. The one where the teams of horses came down and went through the creek and watered the horses before they went out to Udderson. The next little area is where the wooden bridge was, and then the next one is where the new concrete bridge was put in. This is another aerial view of the same year, showing the dock in Port Sydney with the freight shed at the end of it, which was used to keep the freight till the steamers came down from Huntsville to pick up the freight to go to up to Huntsville and up to Hoodstown. This is the third bridge in Port Sydney. We call this the Steel Bridge. It was built in 1905. This is an early picture of Cliff House, run by the Jenner family. The Jenners came to Port Sydney about 1865 and started to take guests probably 1680. And this is addition to Cliff House. It was built probably in 1910 or so by the architecture, and This is one of the early boathouses on in Port Sydney on Mary's Lake. It was owned by Dr. McLaughlin from Cleveland. He was a dentist, and he used to come up here. Apparently he was somewhat of a drinker. And after he had his fill of drink, he would throw the bottles out the top window out into the lake. He was going to give up drinking forever. But after a few days, he called on my father to come and go out and dive down and get as many of the Scotch bottles as possible, which he did. This is an early picture of the Gardner farm out from Port Sydney. It shows the stumps that are still a problem to plow around, and so the pioneers had their work cut out for them. This is a picture of the present community hall. It was built in 1925. This is an addition that was put on about 5 years ago or 6 years ago. The hall was built in 1925 for $5,000 with a lot of labor given by the young men and women in the community at the time. This is a little picture of early fishing in Port Sydney. This is the little spring creek that runs down under the bridge I mentioned before. This is a picture of my uncle, Arthur Clark. He went into, after he sold the Bellevue, he went into the taxi business. And it became so good that he had to build a bus. So he bought a chassis from the manufacturers and built the top on himself, and he used to take passengers out to Utterson. That's before the cars were starting to be used that much. He also used to, during the week, take people up to Huntsville for a shopping trip. This shows some of the early transportation in Port Sydney, the horse and buggies. Also, another way of getting work done is some of the early pioneers had teams of oxen. This is the first car accident in Port Sydney. It was Mr. Moody's car from Hamilton. He got stuck up in Hogs Hollow, and so everybody came to his rescue. There was no tow trucks in those days, and he's the man up at the top right wheel. He knows where the work has to be done, doesn't he? This is an early picture of Christ Church. It was built in 1873. You can see all the trees were cut down, and I guess they're used for lumber to make the church. And this is an early picture of the inside of the church with the coil oil light lamps. And this is the later picture of the church, but this time it's got a couple of chimneys and the belfry. And of course, we have some graves in the front from the early pioneers. This is a picture of some of the early pioneer women dressing up as their grandmothers and showing off some of the early dresses that they used to wear. This is an early picture of Port Sydney, probably 1928-29. This is a dunking, you might call it, of an adjacent church. They used to come up to the beach and have a picnic, and you can see down near the water, they used to dunk the people right in the water to have a religious service for them. This is some of the leisure time on Mary Lake. Shows what the young people did to court their young ladies. Also, they used to sail, but if you can see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 7 people in that boat. I don't imagine any that can swim, and I don't see any life jackets, so it was a precarious recreation, I would say. This is a picture of Port Sydney's first dairy. This is on the Hoof, of course, and it's just going past the town dock on the gravel road. The cows used to go back and into some of the early clearings to spend the day till they were milked that evening. This is a picture of the steel, what we call the steel bridge, picture of a team of oxen. I understand someone told me the man off to the right leaning against is Bob Jenner, the owner of Cliff House. Here's a picture of what we call Indian Landing. Indian Landing at the present time is a pleasant park down the river. This is where the first people used to come up and park their canoes and portage them up into Mary Lake. But at this time, about 1929, people used to picnic down there, also stay overnight. This is a picture of SS Number 9 School. It was built in 1895 and ran till 1947. This is a school I went to when I was a young lad. This is some of the endeavors of the pioneers. In the fall, they used to go hunting and get some of their winter's supply of meat. This is the first Council of Port Sydney of 1934. Port Sydney broke away from Stephenson Township and became an incorporated village in 1934, and this is the first council. Robert Jenner is the reeve, Bill Watson, Alec Hughes, Mel Clark, and Huey McGinnis were the councillors. Every spring in about March, everybody was out on the ice cutting blocks of ice for their ice house. And this is what they used to keep their food cool in the summertime. They'd store it in the ice house insulated by sawdust, and it would last till October. This is an earlier picture of Port Sydney with the steamer Ramona, taken about 1910 or 11, I believe it is, and shows some of the early recreation people just walking in the village. Very few people used to go in swimming. They used to go in bathing, but very seldom they ever went in swimming. This is a picture of one of the first regattas, probably taking the turn of the century, and this is the steamer Ramona that used to run between Huntsville and Port Sydney on a daily basis. This is a picture on the picnic grounds. Every 1st of July they had a picnic on the picnic grounds that were donated by Sidney Smith. All the women in their long dresses, except one young lady there, had the nerve to show off her ankles, so I think she was probably talked about that night. This is, I was saying, very few people went in swimming. This is their bathing costumes. You can see why it was very difficult to swim in an outfit like this, but this is how they got cooled off, I guess. And that's a Ramona in the background. This is an early picture of the lakefront at Port Sydney with some of the boathouses. The shingle mill at this time was gone, and but I still see piles of logs there, and I'm not quite sure what they were doing there, but people used to just do things. And this is a picture of the regatta. This is some of the what they call the joisting. That was always a great pleasure for the crowd. Another early picture of the regatta, probably taken at the turn of the century. This is the tilting contest. The combatants would stand up in the gunwales of the canoe, and the first one knocked off, of course, was the loser. This is a picture of the picnic grounds taken about 1911. Everybody turned out for Dominion Day, and this is a picture of the steamer Northern. It was built in 1876, started to sail from Port Sydney in July of 1877. It was a steamer that it was 80 feet long, 24-foot beam, and it would hold 200 people, and it ran between Port Sydney and Hoodstown. Most people won't know where Hoodstown is, but Hoodstown was an established subdivision at the end of Vernon Lake, with the hope that the railway would go on the west side of Lake Vernon rather than coming through Huntsville. But I think the politicians of Huntsville won out and the railway came through Huntsville. So Hoodstown was more or less abandoned. This is the steamer Joe that used to run between Port Sydney and Huntsville. This is at the Cliff House dock. This is a yacht that my brothers had bought and was running around the lake just for fun, I imagine. A lot of work, but it was supposed to be fun. This is a picture of the Ramona on the Bellevue dock. The Ramona used to come down from Huntsville, and my uncle and aunt would feed them at Bellevue Avenue. How she timed to put the potatoes on the stove was when the steamer came out of the river at the far end, it would blow its whistle, and my aunt would then proceed to put the vegetables on. By the time the steamer got down, dinner was ready. This is a picture of the Toms farm. The Tomses came to Port Sydney area about 1868. And the barn in the background is still there, and the house is still there. If you ever go across Echo Bay in front of Port Sydney and over into the next, what we call Toms's Bay, you'll see this house, and the barn is still there. This is Mr. and Mrs. Toms, one of the early pioneers. They came from a well-to-do family in England. His father was the librarian in the House of Lords. This is a picture of the Toms farm and some of the crops of hay that used to get off in the early days. This is a picture of Grunwald. It was built by the Gall family up in what we call now Rowanwood. And it was at the far end of the lake, or partly up the lake, and it was run by the Gall family for several years. They sold it, and it burnt down on Armistice Day of 1918. This is a picture of Dead Man's Island, or Cox Island, as it should have been called by Captain Cox. Wanted it called Cox Island. He was a master mariner who had come to Port Sydney in 1869. Married my grandmother's sister, who was 22 years of age. He was 62. He established land on lots 3, 4, and 5 in the 8th concession of Brunel, which is now Camp Minneowi. And he built a log cabin on the island and raised 6 girls. One of the girls came back to Port Sydney. There's a picture. One of them came back to Port Sydney about 1965 and told me the story how they used to paddle her father down to the shore in Port Sydney, or to the dock in Port Sydney, and with instructions for them to stay on the dock and not to go up and see their grandmother, who was up in the Liddell store. He would walk to Utterson to get his groceries and mail and then walk back down again. So there was a bit of a feud on between the Coxes and the Liddells. This is an early picture of some of the first establishments in Port Sydney. This is the Moody family, bought property from Sidney Smith and established cottages about 1910. This is a picture of the Gem, a little steamer belonging to Sidney Smith, bringing logs down to the mill. It's Rocky Island in the background, very bare, and the trees have been cut on it. And this is the Gem coming into the cheese dock. Looks like a load of shingles there ready to be taken to some of the pioneers up on the lake. So it was probably waiting for shingles for their roof. There's another picture of the Gem that was used for Sunday school picnics and moonlight cruises around the lake. Another picture of the Gem looks like a posed picture. Some of them fishing and some of them just leisurely watching. This is a Gem that used to run between Port Sydney and Huntsville. This is a picture of it going through the locks. Also another picture of the Gem with Sidney Smith standing there. The picture of the Ramona that ran between Huntsville and Port Sydney. This is a picture of Utterson. Utterson was on the old Muskoka Road and was a stopover place from people coming from Bracebridge up to Huntsville. They had 2 hotels, 2 or 3 stores, a blacksmith shop. It was a busy spot. This was prior to the railway coming through. Of course, when the railway came through, it became even busier. This is a picture of the Central Hotel. It looks as if the photographer got everybody out of the bar to have their picture taken. This is a picture of the floating bridge that used to be across Longs Lake back of Utterson. This is the only way around that cliff that was adjacent to the road. And so they built this floating bridge out of logs and with a railing along the side of it. This is a very picturesque, it had a little turn in it, and it was used for many years until a car went through the railing in 1926 and 6 people were drowned. So that kind of made the powers that be make a move into take the cliff down and make the road along side the lake. But it took a lot of blasting to get that, achieve that. This is a picture of the locks with the Cottrell Mill. This is the mill that was in the center of the little island that was there for many years, run by the Cottrell family. There's another picture of the locks. The locks was built in 1874. The contract was given in 1873 for $16,900. It was finished in 74, but in 75 there was a spring flood, and part of it was damaged, so it had to be repaired. But it was opened again in late 75. And this is the steamer Dorothea. And the Dorothea turned out to be the Ramona. It was refitted and it ran between Port Sydney and Huntsville. This is the Dorothea coming through the locks. The locks at that time was made of wood. You can see the wooden timbers at the side with the joints showing. There was a 10-foot drop between Ferry Lake and Mary Lake, so the locks was very necessary for the steamships to go up through. This is the Algonquin going through the canal between Ferry Lake and Peninsula Lake. See the edge of the locks. The canal was more or less kept in repair, probably better than it is today. This is a little railway ran between North Portage and South Portage, between Peninsula Lake and Lake of Bays. This was established, I believe, in about 1905, and ran for many years till in the early 50s. There's another picture of the railway. There was about 1.25 miles between Penn Lake and Lake of Bays. Lake of Bays is about 80 feet higher than Penn Lake, so it had to chug up that hill and then down the other side. And this is a picture of the 2 steamers on Lake of Bays at South Portage. I think it was the Iroquois and the Mohawk Belle. This shows the railway. Some of the cars that were at used to take the freight and the passengers over. This is a picture of Sidney Smith in his later years. The last time I saw him was about 1925 when he was teaching Sunday school in Christ Church in Port Sydney. On October the 2nd of 1925, I was living back of the store with my parents, or at least with my mother, and I heard the Christ Church bells toll. And I asked my mother what it was, and she said Sidney Smith had died. And that was October the 2nd, 1925. So he was a real impact on the community for 50-some years.
As you have just heard, Sidney Smith made a definite impact on Port Sydney. It is interesting to note that Bill Clark's grandparents were the first couple to be married in Christ Church when it first opened in 1873. Bill Clark now lives at Ferndale on Mary Lake. He has 4 children, Terry, Susan, Bill Jr., and Nancy. He is a grandfather 13 times and a great-grandfather twice. The Clark family has certainly left its mark on the Port Sidney community. A special thank you to Bill Clark for helping to preserve our history.